Okay, welcome to today's lesson. Today we are looking at our third and final instalment on government intervention in the market, and this is price controls. Two types of price controls. There is a price ceiling and a price floor. Let's have a look at the price ceiling first.
A price ceiling is the maximum amount a seller can charge for a product or service. A regulating authority, usually a local government, enforces price ceilings, and they're typically set to protect low-income consumers from being priced out of markets for essential goods and services. Apartments provide a common example. Some cities enforce ceilings on the prices landlords can charge for rent. In such cases, rental ceilings can help make apartments more affordable. Despite their intentions, price ceilings prompt skepticism from many economists. Price ceilings will have no effect if the price is set below the goods or services equilibrium price. The equilibrium price is where the supply of the good matches its demand, and its price stabilizes. If apartments in big city have a $1,800 price ceiling, but their equilibrium price is only $1,500, landlords would not be able to charge $1,800 anyway, rendering the ceiling meaningless. If the ceiling is set below the equilibrium, the rent ceiling is $1,200, while the equilibrium remains $1,500. Other problems appear. Landlords leave money they could have earned on the table, and their services decline because they know they'll rent out their units regardless of their quality. Other problems include black markets that arise as vendors try to get around the price ceiling, and increased fees that are not subject to the restriction. For example, some rentals may charge a lock change fee the tenant did not expect.
Okay, so the price ceiling is essentially government regulation, government legislation dictating the maximum price that can be charged for a particular good or service. You'll find them in places where the government is concerned about consumers not being able to purchase staple foods, perhaps because they believe the price is too high, or services such as housing to make rents more affordable. So we'll model the price ceiling now. Here we have our free competitive market, initial equilibrium, determining price and quantity demanded and quantity supplied. The price ceiling generally lowers the price. A price ceiling won't work if it is above the equilibrium there, or have no effect at all. So price ceilings tend to lower the price of the good or service in question. That's the maximum price that can be charged by firms in the market. Firms cannot charge above this, and it's against the law once the price ceiling is set. Okay, we know from the law of demand that as the price decreases, the quantity demand will increase, and that's exactly what we see here. Quantity demanded increases at that new lower price. But we also know that the quantity supplied is also going to decrease when the price decreases. So we have quantity demanded out exceeding quantity supplied once the price ceiling is in place. And of course, as soon as quantity demand is larger than quantity supplied, we're talking about a shortage, that excess demand in the market. Okay, so a price ceiling is going to result in a loss of welfare, that deadweight loss, because in the market there's now an inefficient allocation of resources to producing the particular good or service. And if we're talking about things like housing and rent controls, price ceilings with their rent control, that can be quite a bad thing. It might exacerbate a housing shortage. So Q1 decreases to QS, and society is neither producing or consuming enough of the good or service. Now let's relate these to the shortage to the law of supply and the law of demand.
The law of supply is one of the most fundamental principles in microeconomics. According to the law of supply, for all other things remaining constant, the higher the price of a good or service, the higher the supply. Producers want to produce more of that good or service at the higher price to increase profits. Conversely, the lower the price, the lower the supply. If you were to graph this relationship with the quantity supplied on the x-axis and the price on the y-axis, the relationship between price and supply is graphed as an upward sloping curve from left to right. This line is referred to as a supply curve. Movement along the supply curve is referred to as supply expanding or contracting as price changes. Wesleya Corp produces electric cars. At a price of $20,000, Wesleya produces 5,000 cars. If the price increases to $25,000, Wesleya will produce 6,000 electric cars. The higher price induces them to build more cars. The law of supply is a theoretical concept. In real life, variables do not remain constant. Things other than price can affect supply, such as prices of related goods, availability, and price of raw materials.
Okay. So that shortage is caused by the decreased price being enforced with that price ceiling, and that decreased price means that the good or service to be supplied is now less profitable. Supply decreases. The quantity supplied decreases as the price decreases, in line with the law of supply. And the other part of the shortage is the law of demand, that decrease in price.
The law of demand is one of the most fundamental principles in microeconomics. It's all about how price affects demand. According to the law of demand, for all other things remaining constant, the lower the price of a good or service, the higher the demand will be. Conversely, the higher the price, the lower the demand. If you were to graph this relationship with the quantity demanded on the x-axis and the price on the y-axis, the relationship between price and demand would be a downward sloping curve from left to right. This line is referred to as a demand curve. Movement along the demand curve shows demand expanding or demand contracting. The people of Loneland are willing to pay $1,000 for a computer when there are 2,000 computers in the market. However, if the price falls to $500, Loneland people will demand 3,000 computers. This is an example of a change in the demand curve where price is the only variable affecting quantity demanded, or vice versa. In real life, things other than price can affect demand, including income in the economy, price changes in competitive goods, and swings in consumer preferences. This type of change in demand is called a shift of the demand curve. Imagine the island of Loneland just discovered a huge reserve of oil underground, and now all of its citizens are considerably richer. In this case, the demand curve for computers would actually shift upwards, since their incomes increase. Demand curves shift based on external factors, rather than the quantity demanded or the price.
Okay, so this is the other side of the shortage caused by the price ceiling. The lower price, a decrease in price, increases the quantity demanded in the market. Decreased quantity supplied, increased quantity demanded, we have our shortage. And we can calculate the effects of a price ceiling on the market in terms of producer and consumer surpluses and changes, and also the deadweight loss, the loss of welfare that occurs as well. Okay, so we know that when the price ceiling goes into effect, the price is generally lower than the market equilibrium. So we get a new price consumers pay in the market, and this is the same price that producers receive for their good or service. Quantity demanded increases at the new lower price. Quantity supplied decreases at the new lower price. And that's where our shortage comes in. We have our consumer surplus before the price ceiling, area below the demand curve but above the price. Producer surplus before the price ceiling comes into effect, below the price and above the supply curve. We can easily go away and calculate the value of each of those two triangles. This is a consumer surplus after the price ceiling. Again, it's simply that area above the price but below the demand curve. And in this case, the change doesn't look that great in terms of the consumer surplus, the area of it anyway. But we can see that the producer surplus is much, much lower as a result of the new lower price being enforced in the market and the reduced quantity supplied. And from our initial producer and consumer surplus together termed of social surplus, everything else that's been lost there is welfare loss. So this is a deadweight loss that occurs with a price ceiling, and again, a nice simple triangle to calculate the value of that welfare loss. So, essential statement, a price ceiling results in a loss of welfare. This is a deadweight loss. There is now an inefficient allocation of resources to producing the good or service in the market. Q1 decreases to QS, and society is neither producing or consuming enough of that particular good or service. Okay, effects on stakeholders. Consumers, some gain and some consumers lose. The low maximum prices is causing a shortage of the good or service in the market. Consumers who are lucky enough, fortunate enough to obtain the good or service at the reduced price. So there's a gain to some consumers as they pay a lower price. But this is usually more than offset by the reduction in consumption of the good or service forced on the consumers as producers reduce the quantity they supply. That's the very essence of a shortage, right? Quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. There are consumers now that can't get their hands on the product. So while a few fortunate consumers are made better off, most consumers, or more consumers overall, are made worse off as a result of the price ceiling. Producers, they're definitely worse off as a result of the price ceiling. We know that as the price of a good decreases, the quantity supplied decreases. The producer surplus becomes much lower compared to the producer surplus in competitive free market equilibrium. And this is because they're receiving less for the good that they're supplying, and they're supplying less of the good. So total producer revenues in the market decrease from price 1 times Q1 to price ceiling times the quantity demanded. Government. As firms decrease their output, this is for employers, sorry. As firms decrease their output as a result of the price ceiling, it's likely that firms are going to have to terminate employment contracts, making workers redundant, making workers unemployed. There's no net gain to employment in markets affected by a price ceiling, and with increased unemployment, it's clear that many workers will be worse off. And now we're talking about government. Sorry, it's just a little confusion in the diagram here. The government is not directly affected in terms of its budget. The other way, forms of other government interventions such as indirect taxes and subsidies. Indirect tax is going to boost the government budget. Subsidies are going to put pressure on government budget. So the price ceiling doesn't cost the government anything to implement. There may be associated policing and enforcement costs. The price ceiling does not generate additional government revenue. But as we know, there's both a decrease in production and consumption in the market where the price ceiling is in effect. So firms are going to become relatively less profitable. They will pay the government less tax, less company tax on their reduced profits. And if the government has taxes on consumption, such as GST or VAT, sales taxes, those consumption taxes, indirect taxes, will be lower. So this will generate a loss of revenue in the market, less revenue overall as a result of the deadweight loss. So a few consumers are happy, not too much of an effect on the government budget. Producers lose out and workers lose out. So, consequences of a price ceiling for the economy. We get shortages, as we have explained. Rationing is quite common. So if the ceiling is to be imposed for a long period of time, the government may need a system to ration the good or service to ensure availability for the greatest number of consumers. So that may take the form of issuing a ticket or a coupon to consumers. Now, the government will only allow as much of a good to be out in the marketplace as there are available tickets. To obtain the good, consumers must present the ticket and the money to the vendor where the purchase is taking place. And that's generally considered a fair way to minimise the impact of a shortage caused by a ceiling. But it's generally reserved for extreme cases, like times of war or severe economic distress. And other methods of non-price rationing include queuing, so waiting in line on a first-come, first-served basis, and the good is distributed until it runs out. And what is quite common when a price ceiling is in effect, there's favoritism or nepotism. So sellers may just choose to sell to their family, their friends, preferred customers, or those with government connections, and those willing to take a bribe. Corruption. Underground parallel markets come into place, especially during prolonged shortages. So often producers will obtain the good at a low maximum price and then on-sell it to consumers willing to pay over and above the regulated price. An underground network of producers and will sell to consumers as much of the controlled good as they want, but at a higher price, higher than the price ceiling, which is generally illegal. However, they provide higher profits for producers and more of the good for consumers, so many will be willing to take the risk of fines or being imprisoned. Underground markets are obviously unfair, inequitable, they're undermining the objectives of the price ceiling, which is ensuring the availability of the good or service at a price that low-income consumers can afford. Even when the government has the best of intentions when imposing a price ceiling, it is so often the case that those with the highest incomes, those with the most wealth, or the most well-connected are going to be able to obtain the good anyway. Right, we know that there's an under-allocation of the resource and allocative inefficiency in the market and negative welfare impacts. So there's that loss of welfare, the inefficient allocation of resources to the production of the good or service in the market. The society is neither producing or consuming enough of the good, and that's a negative welfare impact. A rent control is an example of price control.
Today we'll be looking at rent controls, an application of what we've done already, because rent controls are simply a type of price ceiling. Let's get going. Here's the list of the effective price ceilings, which you've now seen many times. I'm going to talk about each one of these in the context of rent controls, except for a loss in gains from trade. That doesn't really introduce any new issues, so I won't talk about that. Let's talk about the other items, however. Okay, rent controls create shortages. Let's do our usual diagram, except this time on the horizontal axis we have the quantity of rental apartments. On the vertical axis we have price. Here's our demand and here's our supply. The main thing we want to add here is that the supply of apartments in the short run is going to be very inelastic. Why? Well, in the short run, the apartments are simply there. They're already built. There's not much you can do to change the supply of apartments. Now, this is not quite true. You can take an apartment which is about to come onto the market and turn it instead into a condo. You might switch some uses. You might tear down an apartment early, things like that. But basically, the supply is going to be fairly inelastic in the short run. So, we have a controlled rent. This means that there will be a shortage in the short run, and it's given by this amount on the diagram. Note that most of the shortage comes from an increase in the quantity demanded when you push the rent below the market equilibrium rent, when you lower the rent. Only a little bit of the shortage comes from a decrease in the quantity supplied. In the long run, however, the long-run supply is going to be much more elastic than the short-run supply. So in the long run, the shortage will get much worse. In the long run, what will happen is that fewer apartments will be built, more apartments will be allowed to run down, to become dilapidated, to slowly go off the market. Apartments will be turned into condominiums. Instead of building apartments, people will build car garages, people will build other types of housing, and so forth. So in the long run, the shortage from a rent control gets much worse than in the short run. Here's an interesting graph from Ontario, Canada, showing how rent controls can reduce the number of new units being built. So prior to rent control even being debated, there were about 30 to 40,000 new units being built every year in Ontario, Canada. After rent control was put into place in 1975, there were fewer than 10,000 new units being built every year. Also note that the number of new apartments being built, which might be rent controlled, declined even before rent control was put into place, and that makes perfect sense. An apartment has got to pay for itself over 30 or 40 years. They're very durable, long-lived assets. So if you hear today that in the next year or two, rents may be controlled, you're going to say, well, I don't want to build this apartment unit. It's not going to be profitable anymore. I was expecting so many rents for the next 30 or 40 years. That's now been cut. A unit is not going to be profitable. I don't want to build it anymore. And that's exactly what we saw. A discussion in rent controls reduced the number of apartments being constructed. We've also put, by the way, the number in red, the number of non-rental controlled housing that was being built at the time. And you can see it didn't change very much. So this illustrates that it was the rent control itself and not other factors in the market, such as the state of the economy, which reduced the number of rent-controlled apartments being built every year. So this illustrates how rent controls can create a shortage by reducing the supply. As with other types of price controls, rent controls create reductions in product quality. So the rent controls reduce the return to landlords from renting apartments, and owners are going to respond to that price control by trying to cut costs. So they're going to reduce maintenance. They're going to slow down the repairs to elevators. They're not going to mow the lawns as often. After all, they can still sell just as many units as they did before. They can keep all of their units rented at the rent-controlled price, even when they cut maintenance and repair costs and amenities, and they don't put in the new pool or they don't put in a playground and so forth. They're no longer in a competitive market. They have lots and lots of people who want to rent their apartments at the below market price, so they don't need to spend so much on maintenance and repairs and other benefits. And since their profits are falling, they want to try and cut costs as much as possible. Indeed, when rent controls are very strong, serviceable apartment buildings quickly turn into slums, and slums turn into abandoned and hollowed out buildings. This happened in New York City, this happened in Paris, this happened in many cities around the world which instituted strong rent controls. Rent controls create wasteful lines and other surge costs. So finding an apartment in New York City often takes a long time, and you have to spend a lot of money to get a rent-controlled apartment. In one famous episode of Seinfeld, George looks for apartments by consulting the obituaries and rushing to the landlord anytime he sees someone who died who had a nice apartment. And that's in fact one of the techniques which New Yorkers use to try and get a rent-controlled apartment. Another effect of rent controls is to increase discrimination, because rent controls reduce the price of discrimination. In a free market, landlords might discriminate, but then they pay a price because it's going to take them longer to rent out the apartment. But precisely because the rent control makes the quantity demanded exceed the quantity supplied, there are more people lining up to get apartments than there are apartments. So landlords can more easily or at lower cost pick and choose whom they rent to. Therefore, for minorities or for people with children or for people whom landlords are perhaps slightly don't want in their apartment, the cost to them of obtaining apartments is going to be even higher than for the average person. Another effect of rent controls, which is very common, is paying bribes to get a rent-controlled apartment. Bribes, of course, are illegal. This is illegal, but there are ways of disguising the bribe. One way, for example, would be to charge extra for a furnished apartment. What does a furnished apartment look like in New York City for a rent-controlled apartment? It looks like this. That's a furnished apartment. You get the idea. It's a way of paying a bribe under the table. As with other types of price ceilings, rent controls create a misallocation of resources. That is, the apartments are not allocated to the renters who value them the most. If you ever get control of a rent-controlled apartment in New York City, for example, you never, ever, ever give it up. So I've known some people who keep an apartment in New York City just as a vacation home, just for the summer. They go there occasionally. It doesn't have a lot of value to them, but the price is so low that it makes sense to keep the apartment. If they had to pay the market price, then the high-value bidders, the ones who really valued the apartment, would bid the price up and the goods would be allocated to them. Instead, what we have is people who only use the apartment occasionally, keeping the apartment, while other people with large families are scrunched into apartments which are much too small for them. Another classic example, the older couple who stay in their large rent-controlled apartment even when their kids have moved out. It doesn't make sense for them to move out because they're not paying the full price. They're not paying the actual value. So you get apartments who are allocated to older couples who actually have a low value for the apartment, even when there are people who have a much higher value for that same apartment and they cannot find an apartment. One study of this found, for example, that 21% of renters in New York City live in an apartment that has more or fewer rooms than they would choose if they lived in a city without rent controls. So the apartments become misallocated. Okay, that's it for price ceilings. Next time we're going to be looking at price floors, a price below which it is illegal to go.
If you want to test yourself, click Practice Questions.
Okay, let's go into some specific calculations now. We've seen the effect of a price ceiling. Let's put some values on the effect of a price ceiling. Okay, so we've got our classic price ceiling model here with the shortage emerging where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. We can calculate the value of the shortage, and it's just the difference between the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. In this case, 100 minus 20, 100 being the quantity demanded, 20 being the quantity supplied. So we have a shortage of 80 million kgs in this market. Calculating the value of the consumer surplus and the value of the producer surplus. It's coincidental that they are the same amount. They certainly do not have to be. Okay, so for the new consumer surplus, we are calculating a rectangle and a triangle, and then adding those two together. In this case, it was 45 million, which was the same as the initial consumer surplus, I believe. And we're just calculating a triangle here for the producer surplus. Now, the producer surplus might be a rectangle and a triangle as well. And we can see it's much reduced down to $5 million. The value of the loss there, the triangle, the deadweight loss. We can calculate changes in consumer expenditure. Okay, so from our initial model, this is the value of consumer spending before, so the price times the quantity demanded, which equals $210 million. And the change in consumer spending after drops right down to 50 million, and that's largely to do with the reduced quantity being able to be purchased. Lower price, lower quantity being purchased. Producer revenues can be calculated as well, the change in producer revenues. Now the producer revenues are going to be the same as the consumer expenditure in the free market, free competitive market. So from our initial model, the price times the quantity will give the producer revenues. That's the same as consumer spending, expenditure. And producer revenues after fall away with the lower price and the lower quantity being supplied is reduced to just 50 million. So the change in revenues, 210, the initial minus 50, the subsequent, and this change in revenues is negative $160 million.